created by the United Nations Environmental Sabbath Program, begins with these words: "We have forgotten who we are. We have alienated ourselves from the unfolding of the cosmos. We have become estranged from the movements of the earth. We have turned our backs on the cycles of life. We have forgotten who we are." It was not always this way. Both our sacred and scientific texts tell us a story about a different way of being human on planet Earth. In the beginning, Genesis tells us, we lived in a lush garden that we shared with animal companions. We were so intimate with these companions that we were able to discern their true nature and call them by their true names. In the beginning, we knew that together we were nephesh, the Hebrew word for all living beings which share the breath of life. That breath which came from God. And we shared not only the breath of God, the breath of life, but also our food, the abundant plant life that God caused to grow in profusion across the earth. Together, all genders and animals lived together in harmony and peace. In the beginning, before the shadow of sin fell across our world and introduced enmity between the genders and between the human and non-human worlds. Well, in the beginning, our scientific stories tell us humans descended from trees and we stretched ourselves upright, walking all wobbly on two legs and freeing our hands to create culture, tame fire, and caress a loved one. We lived in innocence and fear, gratitude and awe, surrounded by a world with powers greater than us whom we needed to placate and praise. And at least as often as we were predators, we were prey. For millennia, our human story was one of uneasy interdependence with an animal world that threatened us as much as we threatened it. Or put positively, we lived in balance with a natural world that we shared with other species but did not dominate. Such a world is envisioned by the writer of Psalm 104. William Brown, in his book, The Seven Pillars of Creation, the Bible, Science, and the Ecology of Wonder, shows that the psalmist that wrote Psalm 104 discerned a common denominator among all creatures, human and non-human, wild and domestic. All the tenants of God's cosmic mansion were recipients of God's providential care. Humans, he says, constituted only one class of occupants, and in this psalm, there's no first class. Human labor was confined to the day, not the night reserved for the animals of the forest, including the lions, to exercise their rightful living. Vegetation was shared by cattle and human beings, absent as any hint of human dominion. By recognizing that God provides for all, the psalm generates a sense of gratitude and awe. But this world, the world of the psalmist, is no longer the one most of us experience. We live in a world that is out of balance. To be sure, humans have gained greatly by the technological advances, the powers that we have gained over the natural world. And yet, perhaps we might suggest the time has come to rebalance our power with that of Mother Earth. We live in a world in which people too often turn a blind eye to the suffering of other species, not just to crickets, but to the millions of mammals we process through our factory farms and species that are now dying in what's been called Earth's Earth's sixth mass extinction now underway, the very first one caused by human activity. We live in a world now that places no limits on humanity's full spectrum dominance over planet Earth. And as a result, our climate is heating up beyond sustainable levels. Now, in order to live in this world of dominance over the rest of life, we are required to live with a certain denial. A denial of the suffering that our actions cause to other species and to other human beings. But this denial comes at a cost. For the more cut off we are from the suffering of other creatures, the more spiritually alienated we are, not only from animals, but from people too. And the more spiritually alienated we are, the less able we are to experience true joy, true gratitude, and real awe. It would take longer than we have today to trace the causes that led to the situation we find ourselves in. But at some point along the way, in the past half a millennia, we stopped living in a sacred universe. And we started living as though only the human had value. We began to live in a disenchanted world. A world devoid of spirit except that found in the human mind and heart. Even God was pushed out of the picture or put into a neat spiritual box, cut off from the natural world. That's one story. It's a story that is taught in our schools and processed through our economies, but of course it's not the whole truth. For in spite of it all, something in our spirits knows another truth. It's a truth that William Greenway calls agape, the Greek word for love. That irreducible reality of a love that transcends species boundaries and persists despite all the forces conspiring to squash it. In fact, that love is demonstrated here today. It's demonstrated in the love we share with our companion animals. It was demonstrated to me just before the service by a member of the choir who said to me, "I just discovered where heaven is." And I said, "Where?" And she pointed to the dog. Heaven is where the creatures are. On some level, we still know this. Greenway writes, people give dogs, cats, horses, birds, and other non-human creatures, even plants, personal names. They communicate with them, feed them, live with them, play with them, and look to them for companionship. They care for them when they are ill, take joy in their delights, and grieve. Don't we? We grieve them when they die. But he goes on to say, people also eat them and wear them and experiment on them, often all in the same day. For we live these deep conflicts daily. It's difficult to bring these moral conflicts into our consciousness, for we know we're all complicit. We're all complicit in the webs that create suffering for humans and non-humans alike. And there are no easy answers. I struggle with whether and how to eat animals, but I haven't succeeded in becoming a vegetarian. I still eat meat, even though I try to hem it around with certain ethical criteria that I can live with. In the midst of my own ethical struggles with my relationship with the natural world, it helps me to recall the words of the great Albert Schweitzer, who developed the ethic of reverence for all life. Schweitzer acknowledged that if one has reverence for all life, existence will become harder in every respect than it would be if one lived for oneself. But he said at the same time, it will be richer, more beautiful, and happier. for it will become, instead of mere living, a real experience of life. So the question I pose to everyone here today, including myself, is how wide is your circle? How wide is your circle of reverence, of care? From indigenous peoples around the world, I've learned about the circle of life. The circle of life that encompasses all that is animal, plant, human, rock, stone, moon, river, and stars. I've learned all is sacred and full of spirit. And from my own deep study of our sacred scriptures, I've also seen an appreciation for the whole web of life, pulsating in beautiful psalms like 104, in our creation stories, and even in the words of Jesus, who preached about a God who feeds the sparrow and clothes the grass of the field. It's not too late to rediscover the sacredness of the earth within our own tradition. And as we do so, we'll remember who we are and recover our rightful place within the community of creation. So today we celebrate our pets, and yet let us spare some thought for the animals we continue to eat, and for crickets and caterpillars too. Let us wrestle honestly with the question of when it's moral to take human life and when it's not. In closing, then, a personal story. My spouse Robin and I have developed a practice of catching and releasing spiders that we find in our house. Now, I will admit to you, the bigger they are, the harder this practice is. And I've not yet fully overcome that ick factor. There's just so many legs. But I will admit that the more I catch and release spiders, the greater appreciation I have for them, for their own unique spiderness. I've noticed that when I toss them from the plastic container into the trees and the grass in front of my house, I admire how they can launch themselves into the air on silky threads and parachute gently to the ground. I notice the intricacy of their webs, their designs. Sometimes I even remember to thank them for keeping down the mosquito population around my house. But this spiritual practice of catch and release comes with a warning. For oddly enough, I have found it harder and harder to kill any insects at all. Now, I know that my newfound sensitivity to insect life probably sounds ridiculous to most, for by any modern measure, this is not normal human behavior. But I would like to think, at least, that if I were to see a cricket perched on the edge of a jetway, I would watch with delight as it launched itself into freedom. And I hope you would too, because of the God who created a world teeming with life and called it all good. Thanks be to God.